Hello, I'm Andre Churchwell, Vice Chancellor of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at Vanderbilt University. Welcome to our second event centered on this moment in America, violence against Asian Americans and Asians through the lens of history and racial justice. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for this important discussion this afternoon. For those who joined us for our first session in late February, you may recall the impetus behind these events. We remain keenly aware that this moment in America is unlike any other. We felt that it is important to hear the voices of numerous marginalized groups of our nation and Vanderbilt community. Though the triggering events that led to widespread activism and awareness of virulent racism in our country were the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, both African Americans, it became immediately apparent that many other members of our nation's diverse tapestry have been attacked, both verbally and physically, including members of our LGBTQI+ community, Latinx, Native American, Jewish Americans, and many others. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, people of Asian descent have experienced a staggering increase in violence, xenophobia, and racism, which has had a significant impact on many members of our community. As stated in the New York Times April 3rd article, the violence has known no boundaries, spanned multiple generations, multiple income brackets, and regions of this large country. Unfortunately, it is likely that these heinous acts will continue to occur until we as Americans and members of a just and civil society use the levers of our democracy to effect purposeful, lasting change. John F. Kennedy addressed the challenge and benefit of diversity in a speech at American University in 1963. He said, I quote, "So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For, in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. So at Vanderbilt, our shared benefits and assets must compel us all to value our vibrant diversity and to be even more committed to inclusion. Today, we will focus on hearing the voices of members of our Vanderbilt family of Asian descent, which includes members of Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islander heritage. To continue this dialogue, we've invited 5 individuals representing our student, faculty, and staff communities to reflect on this moment in America, both personally, professionally, and also academically. Joining me on our panel today are Iris Kim, a senior majoring in medicine, health and society, and neuroscience, and founder of the Vanderbilt Asian American Studies Initiative. Abe Nathan, a senior majoring in medicine, health and society, and political science, and president of the South Asian Cultural Exchange. Tao Lei, an MD, PhD, MSTP student in molecular physiology and biophysics, and the 2019-20 Student Life Liaison of the Graduate Student Council. Kayla Leong, a doctoral intern in psychology at the University Counseling Center, and lastly, Ben Tran, Associate Professor of Asian Studies and English. I want to thank all of you for joining us today and taking time out of your busy days to lend your experience and thoughts. I'd like to start by offering each panelist the opportunity to introduce themselves and offer a few minutes of how this moment feels and what it looks like to each of them. Then we'll move on to specific questions. First up is Iris Kim, a senior majoring in medicine, health and society, and neuroscience, and founder of the Vanderbilt Asian American Students Initiative. Iris, please tell us about yourself and how you and your community are experiencing this moment.
Thank you, Dr. Churchwell. As you said, my name is Iris, pronouns she, her, and I am a second generation Korean American. And as a second generation Korean American, I do feel my heart weighing very heavily in my chest today. I was actually very ready to speak words of optimism and the encouragement that VASI, the student led Asian American Studies initiative, that our team has received in the changes being made for Asian American students on this campus. But honestly, after hearing the news about Dante Wright, I am just very tired. And I'm tired because there have been endless conversations where I've had to explain and educate while I'm advocating. I'm tired because people really haven't known about anti-Asian racism until mass media finally considered it a trendy topic in the last few months, when this has been going on for hundreds of years. And I'm tired because even if I do give my small perspective here today, it's still only a sliver of the huge expanse of Asian American experiences that are just so often lumped together, because we all stem from the same continent, but we're not a monolith, and definitely we'll talk more on that later. But right now, I'm just feeling the heaviness of those conversations and also the conversations to come. I know my family is probably listening to this panel, and it is hard as a second generation child to reach across those generational differences and have to explain my Asian American existence, this history that in America that came before their immigration, having to do that with my loved ones. And that is a very isolating feeling. But I have to, because otherwise, how do I even begin to comprehend the lived experiences of Black and Brown people in this country? And how do we find the time to even have these discussions when the hate and the murders and the violence is just ongoing, and we just only have time to react? So at the same time, I'm also a student and I'm graduating in a few weeks. I'm wrestling with post-grad uncertainties as much as the next person because of this pandemic. So it's a whole amalgamation of feelings, and it's very easy to find myself doom scrolling on Instagram and just being weighed down in discouragement. But at the same time, I am encouraged, I do need to say, because it is also very empowering to be with professors, to be with staff, to be with team members at the school that are very much in support and encouraging our efforts. To know that I'm not alone in these feelings. And yeah, when I do graduate, that there are young people and future generations ready to continue with these challenges. So a lot of feelings there.
Boy, thanks, Iris. We appreciate that. Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Abe Nathan, a senior majoring in medicine, health and society, and political science, and president of the South Asian Cultural Exchange. Abe.
Thank you, Dr. Churchwell. As you said, my name is Abe Nathan, and I'm a senior at Vanderbilt, involved with the South Asian Cultural Exchange, and I'm a second generation Tamil American. I think I'd like to echo a lot of what Iris was saying about this moment feeling very heavy. The Atlanta spa shootings were very close to home for me. I'm from Marietta, Georgia, and it just is a reminder that this violence and hatred is kind of inescapable. As you said, the anti-Asian violence we've been seeing and just racism across the country we've been seeing doesn't discriminate based on socioeconomic status, where you live. It's kind of built into the foundations of this country, and that's been very hard to grapple with. And I think I'm currently taking a class called Transnational South Asia, where we're learning about the histories of the South Asian diaspora to the US, and how for a really long time, Asian and South Asian people were seen as the other, and there were very concerted efforts to make sure they didn't come into this country. And it was only recently with laws passed to, bring intake of smart engineers, doctors, that this even model minority myth has been created in the US. And I think despite the decades of, progress we have seen racially in the US, it's still upsetting to know that I can pick up my phone at any moment and be scared that there's a notification about a racially motivated act of violence. And that's exhausting and tiring, like Iris was saying. And I think personally, a lot of the recent moment for me has been grappling with how to be a good ally to other people, marginalized peoples experiencing this pain and fear right now. I know this particular strand of anti-Asian violence doesn't necessarily target people who look like me. And I think being there for my friends and peers who it does affect most significantly has been something I've been working on, especially since this is true across communities in the US. We've been seeing since last summer with the terrible acts of violence against Black people in the US, and even the rhetoric that our President Trump had said against Latinx immigrants coming into the US. It's just, these are problems rooted in white supremacy and institutional racism that are systemic, and they need to be addressed as so. And in any given moment, it could change to another marginalized group, and we would have to support them as well. So I think just knowing that has been tiring, and shows that there's a lot of work to be done. But above all, like Iris is saying, I think I am emboldened by the work that I've seen being done by students, faculty, staff, the SCSJI at Vanderbilt, the Asian Studies Department. I've been able to have a lot of really great conversations with my peers and mentors. And even the fact that we're having a conversation like this, I think, shows that there's work that needs to be done, but it is being done and progress can be made. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. Next, we're going to listen to Tao Lei. Tao is an MD PhD student in the School of Medicine, studying in molecular physiology and biophysics, and the 2019-2020 Student Life Liaison of the Graduate Student Council. Tao, can you share your thoughts too?
Thanks, Dr. Churchwell. As Dr. Churchwell mentioned, my name is Tao Lei, and I'm an international student from Vietnam. Pronouns she, her, because I'm a woman. I identify as a woman. I'm also a medical student, a graduate student, a student life liaison, a patient advocate, and a socially anxious introvert. I share these because this is through these identities and experiences that I perceive, process, and understand the events that are taking place around me, especially during these very tough times in the country. When the pandemic hit, like many of you have shared before, I started hearing more reports of anti-Asian discriminations, and this is in the settings of increasingly reported racist acts and murders of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in America. And having lived here for nearly half of my life, what I learned to do during tough times is to try my best to focus and channel all of my anxious and at times indignant energy into, just doing the best that I can in my communities. And that means, focusing on my academic work, my community services, volunteer works, to learn from and give back to the many communities that have welcomed me in during my time here. It can also mean suppress a lot of fears and anxiety, because if I let those arguably legitimate fears in, they might become too much and would have just paralyzed me and prevented me from doing all the things that I've been able to do up until this point. But the recent shootings in Atlanta was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. Because my mom and I learned massage therapy together when I was younger. My mom herself earns most of her income now by giving acute pressure massages to older adults in our neighborhood in Vietnam. I myself have always been fascinated by the healing nature of these techniques, and this was even before I went to med school. And I did a lot of research actually into massage therapy and alternative medicine as part of my liberal arts education in college. And I'm sharing this because we all know the victims of these shootings were Asian women working at massage parlors. And because before the country heard from the mass killers about his alleged motive, words like fetishization, submissive, objectification have already begun running through my head. As an Asian woman living in America, these are the things that I unfortunately feared, and I'm sure many others as well. From when I walk down the street to when I go on dates and try to figure out whether my dates were interested in me because of me as a human being or because of the stereotypes rooted in the racism and imperialism that they have learned to associate with Asian women like me. And as we learn, the mass shooter cited sex addiction as his reason for killing, and we don't even know whether the massage parlors workers he killed would have been considered themselves sex workers. But the answer to this question to me is less relevant because as long as the mass killer and the society that he lives in continue to sow the seeds and allow for the violence and murders against women, Asians, Blacks, Indigenous, and other people of color and from other marginalized groups to take place in broad daylight, such that murder or violence against innocent human beings could be thought of as a solution to eliminate temptations by a young white man. So although I did not grow up in this country, I can't help but see myself and in the victims of the Atlanta shootings. Life takes a different turn and I could have easily been in their spot. So for me and for many others as well, this movement in America feels incredibly fraught. I'm fearful of myself, but also more than anything, I'm fearful for those who don't have the privileges and simply the full fortune not to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, like I have. From the Asian elders walking down the streets of Chinatown in New York or LA, or the Black and brown person just, out going about their business, jogging, driving in the cars, or simply sleeping in my own beds. So those are the thoughts that I've been having recently.
Tal, thank you so much for sharing that and being so vulnerable and sharing that with us. Next on our panel is Kayla Leong, doctoral intern in psychology at the University Counseling Center. Kayla, what are you feeling in your family?
Hi, thank you, Dr. Churchwell, for the introduction. My name's Kayla. I identify as Chinese American and I use she, her pronouns. My parents are immigrants from Hong Kong. I'm a first generation college student, first person to graduate college in my family. These are things that I'm immensely proud of. Echoing a lot of what my peers have said so far, I'm feeling afraid. I'm feeling scared about my safety, my well-being, the safety and well-being of my family, my good friends, and my community in general. For the very first time, I've felt unsafe. Last weekend, I went to go get a haircut as one normally would, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be okay. And I asked my partner to come with me, which is something that I've never, ever done before. I'm worried about being in the South. I'm from New York. I'm worried about the stereotypes being in the South and what that might mean for my safety. I want to echo the feeling of feeling frustrated too. I'm frustrated at the lack of action, the lack of response systemically, and I'm especially frustrated at performative allyship. Lots of Black squares on Instagram over the summer and lots of silence now. And it's unfortunately made me really evaluate my relationships with people, my friendships, the people who deem themselves as allies have been silent. And I'm feeling tired. I'm tired of waking up every day feeling tense, not knowing what headlines I'm going to be seeing today, what traumas I might be experiencing today, what triggers I might come across today. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I feel really tense. I feel really alone too. I'm one of the only Chinese American employees at the UCC, and I don't feel like I have a community here. And that's really hard. Even just now sharing this space with you all, I feel validated and heard. Tao, as you were speaking, I noticed myself becoming emotional because I know those massage parlors. I've seen them growing up, visiting my grandparents in Chinatown. I know those people. And I just felt my heart hurting as you were talking, Tao. And I'm grateful for this community that I have now, but I want more. I want more space. I want more space to process, and I don't want the conversation to end after this, which has been really difficult in the spaces that I've been taking up. We have a conversation the conversation is open and none of the supposed allies are saying anything, it's met with silence. And then I feel like the responsibility is on me to say something, to start the conversation, to get the conversation going. And that's not my responsibility. I'm exhausted by that burden. So all that to say, I'm feeling a lot of things, but the main things are scared, tired, and frustrated. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. My goodness. Thank you so much for sharing that. And finally, from Ben Tran, Associate Professor of Asian Studies in English. Ben, what are you feeling? What are you hearing? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Dr. Churchwell, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Because to be honest, I didn't expect this upswelling of emotions that's kind of sweeping through me right now. I'm Vietnamese American. I prefer the pronouns he and him. And I was born and raised in the South. I grew up in New Orleans, Nolens, and Atlanta. And I'm tired because it's less than a month since the Atlanta shootings. And there have been more shootings in Texas, and the Dante Wright just kind of gutted me the other day. We have all talked about how this anti-Asian racism is not new. It has a wider context. It's in the fabric of America. But I want to bring our attention to what else is happening in the South during this month of shootings. The suppression of voting rights, the inane debates about gun control, the unwillingness to mask up, all out of the name of freedom for one's individual rights. But that individualism denies the rights of so many people. What makes me so mad about, I'm mad, I'm frustrated, I'm tired too. But those women who were shot in Atlanta were in their 60s and 70s. And one of them had to commute and spend the night at the massage parlor because our society and the commute was too far away for her to go home at night. These women have to continue to work and to care and to serve us because our society cannot provide financial security, medical health care. I say that as the state of Tennessee denies Medicaid expansion for Tennessee citizens. That's frustrating to me. I don't get it. It makes no sense to me for the simple fact of caring and the well-being of each other, which these women did so brave and courageously. Yet we deny them the right to live the way they want to live with safety and protection. That's what's hard for me. We can talk about racism all we want, but this is a systematic problem. It is part of our history, but it is oh so present in our current legislation, the decisions we make, our political discourse, and quite frankly, our ignorance. I don't get it. I don't understand. I echo all my panelists what they say, but I'm befuddled and confused. Because what should be so right and so easy, we have the resources, but we just can't do it. And that, to me, makes no sense.
Ben, thanks. I want to thank everybody on this panel for their open, personal statements. I realize how painful some of this is, but it is really amazing that you can share that for our community here, because I'm sure there are very similar thoughts being shared. So thank you for those reflections. My first question to pose is to Iris. And Iris, how have you been processing the ongoing anti-Asian racism and violence against Asian elders, women, and children? And what do you think needs to be done?
Yes, just to echo what everyone's been saying, yeah, this has been going on for a very long time. And I also want to just reiterate how this space has somehow become very much needed. I think we suppress a lot of these emotions, and that is a result of believing that we have minor feelings and that, you know, our feelings are not adequate or justified enough to talk about them. But anyways, yeah, so in my short 21 years of life, last year was when I personally witnessed anti-Asian sentiment for the first time. And I was very disturbed because people who look like my brothers were being attacked. But the most difficult thing for me to process from this time has been just trying to understand, like, why is it the vulnerable populations who are being targeted, you know? And it's something that I'm still struggling to comprehend. So to answer this question, I'm not really processing it yet. Still working through it. And it's so heartbreaking because particularly, at least in my Asian upbringing, the elderly are the most respected members of our families. And they've lived through decades of hardship. They've survived wars, and they brought their families here into the foreign land, you know. And I think of Kim Sonja from one of the victims in the Atlanta shooting last month. She was a grandmother, a Korean immigrant, and she loved line dancing. And she reminds me of my grandma, who also taught line dancing, and it just really hit me. And this isn't to say also that young people are not directly affected. My friends and my loved ones have been called names walking across campus, and I brace myself when I walk into a grocery store. And I even felt my heart drop last week when I was grabbing the mail and a car driving by honked at me. I was just prepared for something. What, like, you know, is it going to be me? Is it my turn now? There is unmistakable fear, and there's a lot of confusion too, because like I said, these minor feelings that Kathy Park Hong writes about, they have been gaslit and dismissed for generations. And I just need to remind myself every day that these feelings are valid. So that's how I've been processing and what I think needs to be done. So I established the Vanderbilt Asian American Studies Initiative, VASI, this year. I also served as the president of our Asian American Student Association last year, and I was heavily involved in the Asian American community building my entire college career. And the biggest problem I found in the past 4 years was just the lack of structural support, because every year we would repeat the same events about the model minority myth, about political activism. We would reteach the same things over and over and over, and it was just so exhausting. And as the president of ASA, I realized how unfair it was for our members, our students, who really wanted to learn, but they had to pay $70K for an education that was not teaching them what they wanted to learn about Asian American experiences. So at Vanderbilt, I do think there needs to be change advocated for across the board. And so individuals are speaking out on social media, and people are learning. People are recognizing this is an issue. That's why we're having this panel. But of course, this is not enough. And I think VASI pushing alongside faculty and alumni and staff is great. But I also want to call on students who are listening, whether you're a graduating senior or an incoming freshman, you should know that you have a huge influence in this institution and you have a say. And it took me 4 years to realize this, and that, you know, every other school except Vandy has Asian American studies. And, you know, while I Googled and watched documentaries on my own time, my peers at other schools took actual classes with real live professors and even could sit in a physical space, an Asian cultural center dedicated to their identities. And so this panel has really formed as a result of explicit violence against Asian Americans, but this is certainly not the end, and we can't stop with just this. And so to really address these issues, we need to push for the long-term institutional change and demonstrate that to this university and to whatever institution or communities you're a part of, that we are visible and that we belong. And we can't think of these calls for change in the system as segmented. They're all connected. And it's really only when I started to learn about my own identity that I could finally genuinely, I think, advocate with the Black and Brown communities. Even Indigenous Students Organization this week is pushing for their own studies program. They have a speaker event going on. And so I think as all these initiatives are happening, we should really work together as this one unified push and wrestling with these questions that seem to separate us, because our stories are all built on the same grounds and principles of being in this broken, racialized American system. So, yeah.
Arch, thank you. Thank you so much for those deep, deep reflections. Abi, next question for you. How do we better understand and support the diversity of the communities broadly defined as Asian and Asian American?
Thank you, Dr. Churchwell. Yeah, so this has been on my mind a lot recently. I think in the US, we define Asian communities broadly through the label of AAPI, I've heard NHPI, and then APITA. And these include Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, and then Desi Americans, referring to South Asian Americans. And I think interrogating those labels can be really important, and interrogating how we define and categorize Asian people in this country can be really important, and how we ultimately support the needs of these communities. Because right now, the AAPI label is used to define 17 million people of nearly 50 different races and ethnicities. And that's a huge diversity to be captured under a single label. And we've discussed the model minority myth. And first off, it's just absurd to ascribe characteristics to someone based just off their race and ethnicity. But this idea that Asian people are some exemplar minority, how all minorities and immigrants should act in the US, erases the fact that there are very real needs and differences in the community. There are different political needs, socioeconomic needs. If we look to the recent Atlanta spa shootings, these women were not the stereotype of upwardly mobile, very educated, trying to fit into stereotypical American society that comes to mind when you think of Asian. They were low income, working in a relatively low wage industry, and they have different needs than perhaps you would imagine a very privileged Asian person to have when you categorize all Asian people under a single label. And I think even just understanding the language used, like AAPI, many Pacific Islander scholars have said maybe it's time to separate those labels, since Pacific Islander communities have such different needs than Asian American communities. And even APITA, I personally don't really use the word Desi to identify myself, and a lot of other South Asian people don't as well, but it's still used broadly to define South Asian people. So I think understanding those categories and labels can be really important, and kind of bringing that home to Vanderbilt. During my time at Vanderbilt, I've been involved in the South Asian Cultural Exchange and just broadly in the multicultural community. And I think one really great thing about Vanderbilt is that we have such a diversity of organizations here. We have ASA, the Asian American Student Association, we have SACE, the South Asian Cultural Exchange, and a number of orgs representing Korean, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Bengali, and Pakistani student identities. And that's great. It shows how far we've come in the diversity of the student population at Vanderbilt. But something Iris and I have actually discussed extensively during our time here is how we don't have a broad coalition, I guess, or umbrella organization, like a Pan-Asian, central organization for these students on campus. And right now, a lot of the educational advocacy work that Iris is saying falls on orgs like ASA or SACE. And it ends up repeating, and we don't have a centralized place to work together and learn about our histories. And for the longest time, I think Iris and I were like, should we just start a student organization that does this? Should we just start a Pan-Asian Council? But after reflecting on my time here, I don't think that's necessarily the responsibility of students. I think this is a place where Vanderbilt can show up for its AAPI communities. Like Iris is saying, we have these events, SACE and ASA and all these other orgs put on these events every year that educate about the model minority myth, about colorism within the communities. But everything I learned about the labels that I was just talking about, AAPI, ANHPI, APITA, those are things I learned on my own, separate from Vanderbilt. I was doing work with an AAPI advocacy organization. That's where I learned about these histories. I didn't learn this in an academic space at Vanderbilt, which I think I would have liked to do. So I think this just all speaks to what Iris is saying about the need for some institutional and academic support on this campus to really provide a space for AAPI communities here. And I think reflecting on my time here, I'm really happy to have had the SCSJI, the Asian Studies program, and as a physical space, the Multicultural Lounge in Rand. But that's a single space, one room for all the multicultural orgs on campus. And I think there needs to be more. I think if I come back in 5 to 10 years, it would be really nice to see a physical space, a center where Asian students can learn about their histories, engage critically, and above all, feel a sense of solidarity, belonging, and community on this campus.
Abe, thank you so much for sharing that. My next question is for Tal. Having lived and studied in the U.S. since 2007, what lesson, experiences, or story would you like to share with the community to help us better understand your experience as an international student and an Asian woman living in the United States during these tumultuous times?
Thanks, Dr. Churchwell. And thanks to my panelists for having shared their thoughts with all of us. So I, as an international student and an Asian woman living in the US since 2007, I've always questioned and re-examined my place and role in this country because I'm not a citizen, as well as my membership in the communities that I'm a part of, whether it was in Kansas, Minnesota, Massachusetts, or now in Tennessee. An international student advisor once told me or showed us, like me and other international students, a picture of an egg and asked us to preserve our visa status like one would carefully handle the egg. A missed deadline, a missing piece of paperwork or clerical error could mean an end to our stay and education here, regardless of how long we've stayed or how good of a students we might be. And this does not account for factors that are far beyond our control, such as election of a US president or other government officials who make and carry out immigration laws. And for these reasons, I tend to be cautious, like I mentioned before, put my head down and work as hard as I can to maintain and earn my current education here. And of course, thoughts of being an imposter surface often, especially when my status limits me from funding opportunities or when new immigration laws or travel restrictions are put in place for non-US citizens. But after all, I still had my decision to make. I made a decision to come here, and I remain immensely grateful for the opportunities presented to me by this country and the people, including all of you. However, I find it much harder to stay silent when I witness often invisible, unfair treatments being imposed on those who don't have as much privilege as I do. If I, with all the privilege that I have, still feel helpless and still feel like I don't belong here, I can't imagine what it must feel like for those who know no homes other than the US, whose ancestors inhabited this land from the beginning or were forcefully brought here as slaves hundreds of years ago, when they themselves are still being told either indirectly by other humans, by other Americans, or indirectly by the current laws and systems that are not supporting them. Especially during my time as a medical student, I learn and see with my own eyes, like the structural oppression unfolding, like in the US healthcare systems, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we see the disparate health outcomes of members from historically marginalized groups. And by this, I mean race, class, gender, sexual orientation, religion, and so on. And I recognize we all have seen through this pandemic, and despite all of the scientific breakthroughs, state-of-the-art treatments and interventions, patients' health will not improve if we as a system, if we as a community and country continue to put Band-Aids on gaping wounds and put patients right back into the environments that caused them harms and brought them into the hospital to begin with. And in these moments and having these thoughts, I'm once again forced to question my place and role here. I realized that if I want to be a good doctor, a good scientist, or simply a good human being, a good community member, I need to really confront my fears and resist the internalized voices in my head that tell me that I'm not good enough, that I don't belong, that I, as an Asian woman, need to be tempered and stay quiet. And therefore, it doesn't matter if I'm a US citizen or not. As long as like you quoted, I still breathe the same air and walk the same earth. I need to take ownership of my privilege and education here to speak up and advocate for those whose ultimate well-being is the goal of the profession that I aspire to be part of. So that's just, some of the experiences that I've had that I'd like to share with you all.
Well, Tal, you've given us a way forward. Being a cardiologist and on the medical school faculty, I'm going to enlist your help, so be ready. Kayla, as a mental health professional, can you tell us how COVID-19 and the rise in violence against Asian and the Asian American community has impacted mental health in these communities and on our campus for that matter?
Thank you for that question. I wanted to make a quick reflection on what Tao was saying and reflecting on what a big burden and stressor it must have been to protect that egg, metaphorical egg, to keep that metaphorical egg pristine and crackless. What an immense stress. So I just wanted to quickly reflect on that. But to answer your question, Dr. Church, I think the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated rise in anti-Asian sentiment has undoubtedly impacted Asian mental health in profound ways. We know that racial discrimination is linked to worsened mental health outcomes such as depression and anxiety, and it makes such good sense why one's mood might be negatively impacted by knowing that people who look like you, people who look like your parents or your grandparents are subjected to violence and discrimination. Feelings of anxiety and worry make perfectly good sense and are there for good reason because people are afraid about their safety, their livelihood, and their well-being. Race-based stressors can become traumatic, meaning that they can lead to psychological symptoms that are comparable to PTSD, can lead to symptoms such as avoidance, hypervigilance when you go out, fear of going out, difficulty concentrating, or intrusive and pervasive thoughts about a racist encounter, replaying in your mind all of those videos that you've watched and witnessed and scrolled through on Facebook and Marketplace. All of that can be immensely traumatic. Even when we watch these videos, we experience these vicarious traumas, and our body reacts to that. Our body reacts to these stressors. We feel fear. We have difficulty going to sleep, loss of appetite, lack of motivation. These are common symptoms to witnessing, experiencing, or even just hearing about the violence towards the community. Anticipating and experiencing race-based stigma and discrimination increases the risk for mental health problems, especially when combined with the pandemic stressors that's happening globally for everyone right now. Everyone globally is worried about their physical health, has burdens of caring for loved ones, worrying about loved ones. We might be experiencing bereavement if we know loved ones have passed from the pandemic. And the threat to our security, many people have lost their jobs. This is a global stressor. And now the AAPI now has an additional stressor on top of that. And that can be so overwhelming and burdensome. What makes it additionally challenging and heartbreaking to me as a professional in the mental health world is that Asian Americans are 3 times less likely to seek mental health services than their white counterparts and peers. Discussing mental health concerns, I think, is considered taboo in many Asian cultures. And as a result, Asian Americans tend to dismiss, deny, or neglect their symptoms. We have faulty beliefs or have been told things throughout our lives that make it difficult for Asian people to present to therapy. I have to be successful and I can't show signs of weakness. Faulty beliefs, it's a burden to share my emotions. All of these things are barriers for us to getting to therapy. I think another deterrent is the negative stigma around mental health, the lack of modeling within our community, lack of communication and honest conversations about when we aren't doing well, and lack of awareness about the resources that are available to us. No one has modeled for us, oh, this is how you find a therapist. This is how you advocate your voice in finding a good fit. This is how I can use my power in searching for a mental health professional. No one has modeled that for us. So I'd like to close by taking a moment to share about what we do have at Vanderbilt. So I work at the UCC. The UCC provides individual therapy and group therapy and workshops. Right now, myself and a fellow colleague is co-facilitating an Asian and Asian support workshop. We have urgent care and drop-in consultations every day. So if whoever is listening out there, if you or someone else you know can benefit from these services, please reach out to the OSCC and schedule an appointment for yourself or someone else. We are here for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing that with us. And now finally, Ben, how do we approach anti-Asian racism from a historical and intellectual perspective or standpoint? Can you help us with that?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Churchill, for the question. And I think that question is spot on for us as a university, and I thank my panelists for this because they brought it up so beautifully. There is a serious need and sense for protection and belonging and community on campus. But we have to treat racism as a pandemic, and we need the intellectual investment, we need the financial resources, and we simply need the research into anti-Asian racism as we would with any other pandemic or any other social problem that we have that is affecting the mental health of people or just the public health or the health aspects of our lives. How do we approach this intellectually? We definitely need to invest in it intellectually, and I want to make it very clear. This is not an Asian American problem. This is a US systemic problem. We are not the problem. We need anti-Asian history, anti-Asian context to be taken seriously as a field. Because in large part, to understand racism in America, we have to understand anti-Asian racism. And to understand anti-Asian racism is to more accurately understand anti-Blackness, expropriation of land from indigenous peoples, Latinx movements, and so forth and so forth. It is, in short, to study anti-Asian racism is to more accurately understand US history, US society. And it's not constricted only to the US, but to European history and European society. It gives a more accurate understanding of Asian history and the constitution and formations of Asian societies today. And so, I want to make 3 points to this, which is to say, 1, that we need to understand anti-Asian racism not as part of just the pandemic or this past year, since the words of President Trump. 2, we have to understand this anti-Asian racism as interrelated to other forms of racism and domination. And 3, we need to celebrate. We need to celebrate forms of Afro-Asian solidarity, of class, gender, and sexuality solidarity across the movements, and to learn from those previous movements. And so let me give some paradigmatic examples of these 3 points. 1, the idea that this is not new, this phenomenon, of course it's not new. But if we think about the idea of Georgia officials reluctant to declare that it's a hate crime because the victim, the perpetrator, the murderer, said that he was a sex addict and that he was having a bad day. The idea that this, first of all, this kind of sex addiction intersects with misogyny and the dehumanization and objectification of human women, of Asian women. And this idea of Asian women being sexual temptations, right, who must literally be eliminated, right, as claimed by the Atlanta murder, literally to be killed, can be traced back to the 1875 Page Act, which outlawed the immigration of women from, quote, China, Japan, or any other Oriental country, because they were deemed as sexual threats, prostitutes, who were literally forbidden to enter into the US, right? So another example to build off of that is the presence of the US military boots as an expression and an assertion of the US empire around the Asia-Pacific region, right? So when you had US soldiers, you can name all the countries here: Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, the Pacific Islands, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea. The dehumanization and objectification of women, Asian women as sexual objects, were then catalyzed and continued as the sex trade, the sex industry, and exploitation of women increased with the presence of the US military presence, right? And we can understand this fear that we saw with the 1875 Page Act, and then the presence of the US military and the way they utilized women as this, you know, to view women as both a sexual desire and as a threat. And so the misogyny goes both domestically and abroad at the same time. At the same time, this treatment of women and this objectification of women also necessitates that we think about the patriarchal norms that dominate Asian societies as well. That is also part of the equation and the difficulty in the way that we see patriarchy running across the board. And so in the same way that we see how anti-Asian racism intersect with misogyny in the assertion of US empire and military endeavors, we must understand that anti-Asian racism is related to anti-Blackness and other forms of racism and domination. This is my second point. For example, we cannot understand people of Asian descent who came to be called coolies if we don't understand chattel slavery. Coolies were from India and China who were exploited for their labor in the Caribbean and plantations all over the southern US and out west and all over the world. Let me read from a bit of some words from the historian Moon-Ho Young about this relationship. As slavery continued to define American culture and politics after emancipation, the language of abolition infused the proceedings on Chinese exclusion with no legislator challenging the federal government's legal or moral authority to forbid coolies from entering the reunited freed nation. Indeed, by the 1880s, alongside the prostitute, there was no more potent symbol of chattel slavery's enduring legacy than the coolie, a racialized and racializing figure that anti-Chinese and putatively pro-Chinese lawmakers condemned. A stand against coolies was a stand for America, for freedom. The legal exclusion of Chinese laborers in 1882 and the subsequent barrage of anti-Asian laws reflected and exploited this consensus in American culture and politics. Coolies fell outside the legitimate borders of the United States, right? So those relationships go hand in hand. To give another brief example, we can't understand the building of the railroads out in the US West or throughout the US as both an expropriation of land, of indigenous lands, and the exploitation of Chinese labor, right? So to understand this, we have to look at the relationship between Chinese coolies and the Paiute communities in Nevada, for example, and to understand how this very complicated relationship gives us a more accurate understanding of US colonialism and expansion in North America itself. And perhaps a topic that hits closest to home, to emphasize the second point, is affirmative action. We cannot understand or talk about or debate about accurately the issue of affirmative action if we don't understand the model minority myth and the cost that it comes, which is anti-Blackness, right? And the stereotypes against Latinx communities. So those are some brief examples of how all of this is interrelated in different forms of domination and racism. And so I wanted to end on a more optimistic note. And I will say that the hope that I've derived from all this comes from the students, some of whom are on this panel, and activities just such as this that we have today. But there has been historical precedences that we can draw from, learn from as we continue. For example, in 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia, there was the Afro-Asian Solidarity Movement, whereby newly independent African and Asian nations got together to form a third-party bloc against the first world powers of the North Atlantic countries, in other words, the United States and the Northern European countries, and against the Soviet bloc, the communist bloc, to form what was called the Third World, which was in part to neutralize the nuclear weapons that were threatening the world at that time. And the Third World in this context has a very positive meaning, and one that we should really consider and think about. We cannot think about the civil rights movement in the United States without thinking about it in conjunction to the anti-war movement of the Vietnam War, right? And this is precisely where Asian American studies, Latinx studies, ethnic studies, indigenous studies arises from and comes out of this shared history and conviction of the activists who were at once against the violence in Vietnam and the violence against people of color and Black people in the United States during the 1960s and the 1970s. And one final example is that we cannot understand movements, right? Even the Brown versus Board of Education, unless we understand that in 1885, Mary Tate, a Chinese American, challenged legally the segregated schools in San Francisco. That in turn became the foundation for Westminster versus Mendez case, which was brought by Mexican American students, which in turn was the foundation for Brown versus Board of Education. And my colleagues, and Matthew Shaw at the Peabody School has talked about this recently about this. But all this is to say that this history is all integrated. It is not particular to one group, one community, or whatnot, but it has formed us all. It is baked into our laws, into our politics, into our legal system, the way that we think, and so forth. And so it's all before us. Lots of it has been done, but the challenges remain, and we must, as many of us have said on this panel, invest resources into this. As a university, it must be an integral part of the university's core missions of teaching, research, and service.
And boy, thank you so much. I'm sitting here thinking about all those intersectionalities that you were talking about. And I recall vividly Martin Luther King's strident comments against the Vietnam War. Not a more prominent intersection there, right? The leader of the civil rights movement standing very firm there. Well, thank you all. This has been phenomenal. I have one last question, and you all may jump in. Kind of spinning off Ben's comment about hope. Given all the challenges and opportunities, what gives you hope for the future? Anybody want to just go around the horn? Iris?
Yeah, what gives me hope?
What gives me hope is you guys, but go ahead.
Yes, and then what gives me hope is the future people who will be here, hopefully taking this place in the many more conversations to come, because I think it's really only a matter of time before Vanderbilt establishes a greater space for Asian students here. I mean, every year our statistics go up and up with the representation in terms of Asian American students. I think this past incoming freshman class hit like 19% Asian American. That doesn't even include international students. So there is a lot of space, and people are coming in from various parts of the country and have more and more awareness and knowledge about Asian American experiences. So I am very excited for that. I'm also very hopeful for the people here, like panelists, like Kayla and like Ben and like Tao, because they are here more in the long run than I am for sure. And it is very encouraging to know that there are these people, these resources that students can even reach out to and know, like remind each other that we're not alone in this. That being said, of course, there should be a lot more support for these people since retention, we want that. And lastly, I guess I'm hopeful for future professionals, the students now becoming the Asian American mental health professionals, and just professionals in the future, that are dedicating their lives to the Asian American communities, that they have decided to take that step in their careers. And I think that is something I'm very hopeful for. Yeah.
Thanks, Iris. Abi?
Yeah, definitely would echo what Iris is saying about just being hopeful for the future of Vanderbilt. I think there are so many, as we've seen with the Asian American Studies Initiative, there are students who care so much about this, and faculty and staff who care so much about the future of the AAPI community at Vanderbilt. And I think giving a specific example, I mentioned before, I'm taking a class called Transnational South Asia right now, which I think is kind of an example of what could be on a broader level if we have an Asian American studies program here at Vanderbilt soon. But in that class, we've talked a lot about obviously the systemic issues that exist in the US and just across the Asian diaspora, but also the areas for solidarity, like Professor Tran was saying, like how throughout history there have been solidarities between like specifically like the Dalit people in India who are like below the caste system, not getting too much into that, and the Black Panthers in the US. There have been historic solidarities throughout the histories of Asian people in the US. And I think that's the fact that students are learning about it now and will continue to learn about it and implement what they've learned as future professionals, like Iris was saying. I think that's really exciting. And I think the future is bright. I think people care a lot about this, and that will manifest itself in something better.
Thanks, Abi. Tal?
Yes. Thinking about something that gives us hope, and I think what you all have shared have really lifted me up, and I really agree with Professor Tran about all of us members of minority groups or marginalized groups that coming together to and hopefully allies from majority populations as well, coming together to find a solution for the problems that are deep-rooted in this country's history. I hope that we, just like me, that I'm realizing that, the problem is not just about me, it's about me in connection with everybody else. I hope that we can all get together and realize that we are incredibly interconnected people, very complex individuals who carry with us many different identities at the same time. And for this reason, it doesn't matter, which group we identify with. Violence against one group is violence against all. Like we all have discussed, like anti-Asian violence is also anti-women violence, also anti-poor violence, also anti-sex worker violence. Our fates are all entwined in this moment. And I hope that we can all work together to fight oppression, not just within our own community, but everywhere, because like we have heard, throughout this pandemic, none of us is safe until we're all safe.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Tal. And lastly, Kayla.
Yeah, I feel like I have to have hope, right? Without hope, how can I envision a better future, a better lifestyle for myself, my family, and those coming after me? What gives me hope is allyship. We can't do this alone. We need other people to help us. I know earlier I had mentioned like the frustration I felt at like silence, but what shines more was in my memories, those people who have said something, who have reached out to me to comfort me, to validate my experiences, that shines more brightly in my memory and in my mind than the people who haven't done anything. So allyship gives me hope, and how differently it can present itself, that allyship.
Thank you. And Ben, thank you for the historical precedent, historical footnotes that allow us to understand the past and the current all at the same time, to be honest with you, how they are linked very much so. Well, I want to thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and especially our panelists for providing such tremendous insights and such a rich and personal discussion. We're thankful for each of you bringing forth such powerful perspectives. To our audience, recognize that we have offered no quick, facile solutions during this event, but the issues and concerns raised represent a call to action for us at Vanderbilt and to the nation as a whole. I began with a quote from my hero, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I'll end with another. Kennedy said, and I quote, "Things do not happen. Things are made to happen." This is our charge. This is our charge in this moment. So thank you all again for joining us, and have a great day today. Thank you.